In the 90s, Microsoft wasn't doing very well, and by that I mean they were doing too well. The company was closing in on near domination of every aspect of the software industry, from operating systems to the internet, productivity software to multimedia. They had it all. And another thing Microsoft had all of was essentially all of the PC OEMs of the day. Since the days of IBM PCs and DOS, Microsoft had been the sole distributor of the operating system that nearly every business application ran on. And to ensure that another company like IBM or Digital Research didn't step in and steal the spotlight, Microsoft began to write more strict license agreements with these hardware manufacturers. They offered discounts to manufacturers in exchange for loyalty to the MS-DOS kingdom, like the so-called per-processor fee. In this deal, Microsoft would license DOS at 60% the original price if the OEM paid royalties for every processor they shipped, regardless of whether the machine came with DOS or not, incentivizing the companies to only sell DOS machines. At the same time, Microsoft had also been caught with unimplemented code in Windows 3. The so-called ARD code was designed to detect whether a user was installing Windows on top of an MS-DOS competitor, and fake an error message if it was. After an investigation by the FTC and the Department of Justice, Microsoft eventually agreed to abide by a consent decree. Basically, they promised to cut out the whole per-processor thing, remove penalties for selling PCs with competing operating systems, and not make license agreements that required OEMs to bundle a separate Microsoft product with their PC in order to be able to include DOS. Essentially, a set of rules that made the market for PC operating systems a bit more fair. And honestly, the biggest threat to the Microsoft empire at that time wasn't another operating system. Certainly the company had in no way been kind to the Windows alternatives of the day, but when almost every program a user could want was available, sometimes exclusively on Windows, there wasn't much fear of people jumping ship. Instead, the real way Microsoft could be brought down was through something known as middleware. Not quite hardware, not quite application software, middleware sits between the base operating system and the actual programs a user runs to enable functionality, portability, and better compatibility. Things like the Java Virtual Machine, OpenGL, or even parts of a web browser don't do much of anything on their own. But by creating a uniform environment, they make it really easy to take a program that takes advantage of them from one computer and put it on another. Even if the computers have totally different internal hardware and run on completely different operating systems, so long as they share the same middleware components, they can run the same programs. And that's where Microsoft saw the threat. If middleware environments were allowed to flourish on Windows, a slew of applications would be written taking advantage of them. And once these applications became popular, it wouldn't be too difficult for them to migrate over to other platforms. And once another platform like the Mac or even Linux could do everything that Windows could do, well, there wouldn't be much of a point in paying for a PC with Windows on it. Microsoft's awareness to this threat was the first step in preventing it from occurring though, and one of the key ways they went about neutralizing it was by employing a three-step strategy on potential competitors: embrace, extend, and extinguish. The idea was pretty simple. Say a pesky little JVM threatened the sanctity of the Windows line by potentially allowing programs to run just as well on Linux as on a PC. Microsoft would first embrace Java by writing their own Java Virtual Machine, extend it by adding their own special features to it which users couldn't get anywhere else, and extinguish the threat when their version inevitably became the standard and nobody else could offer the same features. And it wasn't just Java. In fact, there were tons of different middleware environments Microsoft had set their sights on. From Lotus Notes, networking software produced by IBM, Intel's NSP or Native Signal Processing, which gave processors added media capabilities that went around Windows, and even programs like RealPlayer and QuickTime. The real straw that broke the camel's back though was with the introduction of the web browser Mosaic in 1993. Mosaic was the student project of Mark Andreessen and 3 others to improve the rather limited web browsers of the day. It wasn't necessarily the first web browser, let alone the first graphical one, but it is credited with introducing things like inline graphics for web pages, supporting more common operating systems like Windows and Mac OS, and just generally being easier to install compared to its contemporaries. What set Mosaic apart from other browsers at the time ended up making it a winner, not just in the academic circles that it spawned it, but with the increasing number of households that were connecting their computers to the internet. Less than a year after his graduation, Andreessen and a few friends would spin off into Mosaic Communications Corporation, or as they would rename themselves, Netscape Communications Corporation, to release a new and improved version of Mosaic, Netscape Navigator. To gain popularity, the browser was completely free for personal and non-commercial use. To keep the lights on, though, larger business entities would pay licensing fees to use the software. And sure enough, the browser was a smashing success with both groups. Usage of Netscape Navigator pretty quickly usurped that of Mosaic. At its peak, Netscape made up nearly 80% of all web traffic, and it looked like things couldn't be better for the browser. Microsoft, and more specifically Bill Gates on the other hand, were not so happy. They'd completely missed the boat on the internet, and here was Netscape, some scrappy little startup, threatening to kill off the walled garden Windows ecosystem that they had worked so hard on creating. In the months leading up to the release of Windows 95, Bill Gates put out a memo asserting Microsoft's poor online status, along with a plan to get a hold of the new technology before it was too late. The first step was to embrace. Windows 95 wasn't even released yet, and it was already a big deal for Microsoft. From reworking the user interface by adding a start menu, to incorporating multimedia capabilities right into the operating system. And one of the biggest additions Microsoft made was to incorporate tons of internet technologies right into the OS. With those in place, Microsoft reached out to Netscape to make a deal. Navigator would be written using the new Windows 95 middleware written by Microsoft, meaning that the Windows 95 version would have special features over other platforms, or Netscape could write the code all by themselves and have Microsoft compete with them in the browser market. For Netscape though, it was more or less a choice between fracturing their own market or going against the largest software company in the industry. It didn't help that, until Netscape agreed to the deal, Microsoft would also withhold specific details about Windows 95 that they needed to know to be able to develop Navigator for it in time for the launch. The talks ended, not with a definitive rejection to the deal, but certainly not acceptance. So Netscape had left Microsoft no choice. They would just have to make their own browser to ensure some middleware provider wouldn't come to replace them. The problem was, they needed a browser. A company named Spyglass Inc. was responsible for commercializing many of the NCSA projects created at the University of Illinois, one of which was the browser Mosaic. So Microsoft, in need of a browser of the same caliber as Netscape's, got the next best thing and licensed Mosaic from Spyglass. A small 6-person team added tweaks to move the browser up to the capabilities of Netscape Navigator, and eventually Microsoft had the first version of Internet Explorer. The program made its debut in the Plus pack for Windows 95 rather than the actual OS at first, but it wasn't uncommon for OEMs to bundle the Plus pack with their 95 machines, meaning that many people who bought a new computer would have Internet Explorer 1.0 on their desktop right out of the box. Netscape, on the other hand, would have to wait until the launch of Windows 95 to get started on development, in which time Internet Explorer was the only existing web browser that would run on Windows 95. And the fact that IE was free to all users began to cut into Netscape's profits, which included the income they received from commercial licenses. Compared to Netscape Navigator though, Internet Explorer 1 was pretty primitive, and even after the release of Windows 95, Navigator still held its spot as the world's most popular browser, clocking it at nearly 80% of the market. But with the sheer financial imbalance between the two companies, Microsoft could afford to dump as many developers as it took onto the Internet Explorer project to catch it up with Netscape Navigator. The team had started with half a dozen people, and had grown to over 100 by the time Internet Explorer 3 had been released. And in 1996, IE3 was a big deal. It made huge strides in adopting CSS, frames, and other web standards, sometimes even better than Netscape. In fact, the browser could even use plugins designed for Netscape Navigator. And beyond that, Microsoft extended IE by including their own standards to the web, like ActiveX, a security nightmare that allowed for interactive applications to be run right in the web browser. IE3 even gave Microsoft the chance to spread its reach onto other platforms of the day, like the Mac. Believe it or not, for a time there was even Internet Explorer for Unix systems, such as Solaris. With the goal of being the universal platform for web software though, Microsoft would have it no other way. Netscape had managed to hold on for a while, but with the release of IE3, things started to turn around. Microsoft had proved to be a formidable opponent, and between their deeper pockets and the benefit of being able to make Internet Explorer the default browser on most PCs sold, they had a significant advantage over Netscape, whose market share began to drop. The threat of Netscape Navigator running the web instead of Microsoft was soon to be extinguished. As a side note, while Microsoft was doing better than ever in 1997, Apple was not. Between failed projects like Copeland and the Newton, the company was just bleeding money by the time Steve Jobs had returned. Macintosh market share was around 3%, and it was anybody's guess as to how much longer the Mac would stick around. One of the first things he did was announce a partnership with Microsoft, where they would invest $150 million into Apple. And to ensure the platform's continued relevance, promised that for the next 5 years, they would develop software like Microsoft Office, among other things, for the Mac. One of those other things happened to be Internet Explorer, which, as per the deal, would be the default browser on Macs for that same time span. Reactions from the crowd were a bit more, let's say, mixed.
Apple has decided to make Internet Explorer its default browser on the Macintosh.
Though Jobs did win them back when he promised alternatives would be installed alongside it.
Since we believe in choice,
Stepping back a bit though, it was this action, among many others, that prompted Netscape to publish a white paper to the Department of Justice in 1996. A year later, the DOJ filed a petition to find Microsoft in contempt of their 1994 consent decree, with the claim that Microsoft was using their license agreements with Windows 95 to push Internet Explorer, which was considered a separate product, and that the company used their monopoly power in operating systems to gain an unfair advantage in the browser market. Microsoft responded, as expected, that those claims were bogus, or unfounded, claiming that either web browsers did threaten the OS, in which case IE couldn't be considered a separate product, or they were separate products, in which case the Windows monopoly was irrelevant. The judge, Thomas Penfield Jackson, decided that as of yet there wasn't enough evidence to show Microsoft was in violation of the consent decree, nor that there was enough to show that they weren't. He set out the plan for a discovery period to gain more evidence, and stated his belief that the government did have an antitrust case against Microsoft as well. Microsoft, of course, fought the case at every turn. When the preliminary injunction required Microsoft to stop forcing OEMs to include Internet Explorer, they responded with the question, what specific files should they remove? When the judge appointed Harvard professor and expert in cyberspace law, Lawrence Lessig, Microsoft made the request he be removed, which was denied. Their reasoning? He was biased toward Netscape because he had sent 3 emails to the company. The messiest part about this case, though, was the debate over whether Internet Explorer was a critical component of the Windows operating system, or whether it could be classified as an independent product. Microsoft argued that removing the IE icon would result in OS instability, while Judge Jackson responded by deleting it on his own computer in the courtroom to no ill effects. Microsoft relented and agreed to allow OEMs to not have the IE icon on their desktop. 1997 rolled into 1998, and with it, Microsoft was gearing up for the big launch of the next version of their operating system, Windows 98. An appeals court had ruled that the injunction regarding Windows 95 didn't apply to 98, and Microsoft clearly took advantage of that. Beyond including Internet Explorer 4 right out of the box, the browser had been more tightly interwoven with the operating system. From features like Active Desktop, the new Windows Explorer, and even the help topics, it was clear that they were trying to muddy the waters in terms of whether the browser and OS were separate programs. Not even a week after the Windows 98 launch, the Justice Department had filed what would become the Microsoft antitrust case, US v. Microsoft. Later that year it began with some pretty shady submissions from Microsoft, including a videotaped deposition of Microsoft CEO Bill Gates. He comes off as incredibly evasive in the video, quibbling over the definitions of words and refusing every chance to admit any involvement.
What non-Microsoft browsers were you concerned about in January of 1996?
I don't know, what do you mean concerned?
What is it about the word concerned that you don't understand?
I'm not sure what you mean by it.
Is the term concerned a term that you're familiar with in the English language?
Yes.
There was also the allegedly manipulated video evidence, which Microsoft used to claim that removing Internet Explorer from Windows 98 would cause instabilities, an argument which is widely disputed. And emails that had been sent within the company, using language like crush them or taking away their oxygen supply when referring to competitors. The case also featured the comeback of many other businesses Microsoft had competed with in the past, like Sun Microsystems, the creators of Java, and IBM. By November of 1999, Judge Jackson found that Microsoft had abused its monopoly power to harm consumers, and his proposed solution, much like what had happened with monopolies of the past, was that Microsoft be broken up into two smaller companies, one that developed the Windows operating system, and one that wrote the applications such as Internet Explorer and Microsoft Office. The theory being that OpsCo, as it was called, would be interested in making an OS that ran with as many applications as possible, and AppsCo would be interested in making applications for as many platforms as possible. Now, it's up for debate just how effective breaking up a monopoly into smaller companies can actually be in the long run, but this discussion ended up being pretty unnecessary anyways. Judge Jackson was ready to issue the order without any additional hearings. Unfortunately for him, this gave Microsoft the chance to appeal his decision, and as it turned out, the DC District Court of Appeals ended up being more conservative than Jackson. They reversed his order to break up Microsoft, in part because he had a habit of bad-mouthing the company in private interviews, violating the Code of Judicial Ethics. At this point, both Microsoft and the Department of Justice were willing to settle the case, and in 2002, Microsoft was able to receive a much nicer deal. Rather than split into two companies, Microsoft would be required to share details about their APIs, like the ones they withheld from Netscape, to third-party companies, and to appoint a panel which oversaw that to ensure compliance. In November of that year, Judge Colleen Kolar-Catelli approved the settlement, and the case was finally over. The case had originally been started by a petition from Netscape Communications all the way back when their browser still held a majority of the market. But with this ruling, Netscape wasn't coming back. By the first year of the trial, Netscape was already hurting quite a bit. They tried making their browser open source to no avail, and were eventually bought out by AOL the next year. Development on Navigator lasted a bit longer, but eventually ended entirely in 2007. The open source project, on the other hand, well, that one did a bit better. Unnoticed by most during the trial, the open sourced version of Navigator, called the Mozilla Project, was beginning to gain traction. In 2002, the same year the case was finally settled, Mozilla Firefox made its debut. Microsoft, which had slowed down development of IE6, began to lose market share back to Firefox for its improved functionality over Internet Explorer. About a decade later, the EU made a similar decision against Microsoft, requiring their bundled versions of Internet Explorer to start on a page which offered users links to alternate web browsers they could install, which included Mozilla Firefox. The real irony of the whole case is that, in trying to maintain their future hold of the software industry through the web browser, Microsoft had entirely missed out on the real commercial platform of the internet, online services. They tried so hard to ensure Internet Explorer would win out over Netscape Navigator that they let the future monopolies of online content, Google, Facebook, and Amazon, slip right past them. It's debatable just how much the actual settlement of the US v Microsoft case alone actually helped in taking down the Microsoft Goliath, but it's hard to dispute that the tech industry has gotten a lot more open, competitive, and most of all diverse since the days of the Wintel dynasty.